Welcome to How to Build a Web UI for your LabVIEW-Based test system. Christina Rogers, one of the product owners for GWeb Development Software, and joining me today is Milan, a principal software engineer at NI. First, we want to highlight that this recording and the associated files for it are available at this URL. So let's talk about why you might want to add a web user interface to your test system. Especially in today's times, you may want to be able to monitor and control your test system without being physically located with it. And creating a web user interface allows you to control that test system remotely without needing to install custom plugins on the mobile devices or laptop computers or home computers that you might want to use to connect to your system. So let's talk about GWeb Development Software. This is a product from NI that lets you create web applications easily using your G knowledge, your LabVIEW programming knowledge. It is a combination of two things: an editor that lets you create your web application user interface and the client-side code, and also a set of services like hosting and data services that you might want to use. Depending on your use, you might want to use one or both of these pieces. The GWeb Development Software Editor is a little bit like the LabVIEW Editor, but also a little different. I mean, you still are creating a front panel and a block diagram. The diagram lets you create the client-side logic for your web application using a subset of the G programming language. The editor for the panel lets you use familiar drag and drop paradigms to create place controls and indicators on your panel. In addition to the fixed layout that you're used to with LabVIEW, you can also create a flexible layout which will adapt to your device's screen size, which is great for making a user interface that works on both computers and mobile devices.
The other half of it, so what Christina showed us, was the editor environment that builds your web application, gives you HTML, JavaScript, CSS. The other half of it is how do you take that web application, that built web application, and make it available at a URL. So whenever you go to a website, you don't download a zip file of all the contents of your Gmail website. It's actually available in a URL, gmail.com. And when you visit it, you get served HTML, JavaScript, and CSS that shows in the page. So these are what the data services part of GWeb help you do. It gives you hosting, giving you that URL after you upload your HTML, JavaScript, CSS from the GWeb editor, gives you that URL to visit to look at your page. And then the second bit is once you see your page and you have that WebVI running in your browser, because that's where that HTML, JavaScript, CSS that's built from GWeb runs, it's running in the browser. So when you pull it up on your phone, in the browser on your phone, the diagram is executing on your phone or on your desktop inside the web browser. So how do you get that diagram to communicate with your LabVIEW test system, which could be on the same machine, a different network? So you use the data services that are included with GWeb to connect your data from your test machine to your newly made WebVI, your newly made hosted WebVI. So there are a couple of services that are included, both for local development. So the NI web server is you have the whole server with the hosting and the data services all on your own machine that you control, or SystemLink Cloud. So that's a service that we provide where you get the same hosting and data service capabilities, but now you don't, but it's available on the public internet, not just on your local network. So that way we manage all the things needed to get HTTPS and secure communication with the data services working correctly. For user management, logging in and out, you can use your ni.com account to do that. So that's the benefit you get when you use SystemLink Cloud to host on the public internet, and we'll go more in detail in those. But a common question that comes up is, well, how do these services compare to SystemLink server? Whenever people talk about the hosting and the data services, which are the tag service and the message service, the name of them always says the SystemLink tag service, the SystemLink message service. Does that mean I need to buy SystemLink in order to use these services? So that's one thing I want to clear up here. is that the data services that are included with GWeb are free and you can use them in GWeb however you see fit. They're included with your entitlement for GWeb. So that's the SystemLink Cloud access, the NI Web Server access, and all the hosting and data services. It just happens that we have a separate product, SystemLink Server, which includes some of those same pieces, the hosting, the data services, the cloud connector. They're shared and used in both, but SystemLink Server is a different beast that has a whole bunch of other additional services in it, like the tag historian, file management, dashboards, and these modules for advanced capabilities. Like, let's say you have your test stand system and you want to see your test reports in a web UI. It has that as a built-in module so that you don't have to develop all that yourself. Asset management, systems management, and running analysis routines. So that's SystemLink Server. So what's included with GWeb is to web enable your test systems. And that's a subset of the services that's included that you're entitled to use. It's all included in there. SystemLink Server shares some of those, but also has a whole bunch of additional capabilities. They're separate products. So now we're going to talk about your approaches for web enabling a test system. So the best way to get started is to think about who you want to access the test system. So if you want it available over the public internet, the way you would start would be slightly different than if you want it available on your local area network. We'll see later on where if you're using the services that are included with GWeb development software, you could actually transition between them if you need to in certain situations without necessarily rewriting your whole app, usually just with some configuration. But it's useful to know how to start your application, to choose one of these, and to know that's how you want to start. So what we'll start with is the internet access version using SystemLink Cloud. So in that architecture, what we'll do is we'll make our WebVI and web development software. So we'll make a UI, place our controls on it. We'll build and deploy that to SystemLink Cloud. So it'll be hosted there. We'll drag and drop the build package on there, and that'll give us the URL to access the application. Then we'll also have our test system. This presentation is focusing on LabVIEW. So we'll see how we can modify our LabVIEW test system to add new nodes to the diagram, to use those data services, tags, and messages, to read and write data to SystemLink Cloud. And then when you visit that URL on your phone, it'll pull up your built WebVI, and the same data services will be used to talk back to SystemLink Cloud all the way to the test system. So one thing to point out is that while we're focusing on LabVIEW in this presentation, all these data service APIs, the tags and message APIs, NI provides clients for those for Python and for C#. And another thing, if you're familiar with that space, is that we provide open API documents for the REST calls to implement the tags and messages. So that means you could read and write tags and messages from any language where you can make HTTP requests, and we have that documentation. If you look in the notes in the slide, you'll see links to the extra client libraries and to the open API docs. But for the rest of this presentation, we're going to focus on LabVIEW for this system. And actually, one more thing I want to point out is that, so the question of how do I have my WebVI talk to a piece of hardware? So this is showing that approach where the test system itself is a LabVIEW application that's talking to the hardware, communicating with tags and messages with the data services to SystemLink Cloud, and that's how your device interfaces. It doesn't interface directly to the hardware. That same question also comes up as, how do I have my WebVI talk directly to a database? Similar to hardware, that's a resource that's private on your network. Web applications can't talk to databases directly. You could use them in this configuration as well. Your test system is a LabVIEW application that talks to a database, and it could take the data from it and communicate with tags and messages through SystemLink Cloud to have your WebVI access a local database. All right, so now Christina will take us through a demo where we're going to show you that whole workflow. If it sounded like a lot, hopefully it doesn't feel like a lot. We're going to take you through that whole workflow in 15 minutes.
Great. Thanks, Milan. So yeah, we're going to start with a simple LabVIEW application that's just simulating a temperature measurement. And we'll show that it's when running, it's simulating some temperatures. We're showing those temperatures on a graph. If we go look at the diagram for it, this is built on the continuous measurement and logging sample project that comes with LabVIEW. So a lot of this code just comes with the template, but we're going to focus in on the data display loop. So this is where we're taking the simulated temperatures and we're pushing them onto the graph that's on the front panel. And our objective here is to say, well, in addition to showing those values here on this VI's panel, we want to be able to see them in our web user interface. So next slide. So what we want to do is write the data to a SystemLink Cloud tag. To do that, first we're going to open a connection to SystemLink Cloud. And the configuration we're going to use is the API key. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. Now you need to give it the address of the server that you want to connect to. For SystemLink Cloud, we're going to use api.systemlinkcloud.com. You can find that in the context help for this function. Once we've opened that connection, now we need to open the tag that we want to write to. A tag is just a named data storage in the cloud. So we're going to give it a name. And for this, we're just going to call it niconnect.temp. If that tag name doesn't already exist in the SystemLink Cloud, it will get created by this call. We're going to define the data type that we want, which is double for our numeric value, and then wire that to a write tag function, which is going to take that temperature value. And of course, we opened some things. So when this loop is done executing, we would want to close our tag and close our connection to SystemLink Cloud. I'm not going to show wiring that here. Okay, so now.
One thing I want to point out is a question that comes up is, well, how fast can I write to the tags? Can I write 1,000 times a second? So, or how much data can I push into it? So one thing to consider there is that these tags are over the HTTP protocol and it's over the public internet. So probably, and it's hard to say, it depends on your network connection. It depends where your server and where your phone or client, whatever your browser is located, your network quality. All that aside, you should probably look at saying an update rate of about 2 times a second, 2 hertz. Don't expect to go significantly faster with that with the tag API or significantly slower. So things you may want to consider is on your LabVIEW diagram side, if you're collecting lots of measurements, maybe you put them together into one message and you use the message API to transfer a whole waveform at once to look at the panel, to look at on your WebVI. Or if you're using tags and messages, or if you're using tags, trying to keep the update rate around 1 to 2 times a second. If you go significantly faster, it might not, your WebVI might not be able to pull that quickly anyway, or you might not be able to actually push that data to SystemLink Cloud that quickly. So that's just a rough estimate. You could definitely test it and see what you can get out of it, but I'd say that's what you should consider as your update rate. Cool.
Cool. Okay.
And actually go next. All right.
Yes. So next we need to talk more about the API key that we're going to use to connect to SystemLink Cloud. So what an API key is it's just a unique value that is used as to authenticate to a web service. So in this case, you don't want to have to hard code your username and password credentials into a VI to give it access to reading and writing tag values in SystemLink Cloud. So instead, we're going to create a API key specific for this application, and then we're going to put it in here. So let's show how we're going to create that API key. So we're going to systemlinkcloud.com, and we're logging in with our NI credentials because, again, you have access to this as part of your GWeb entitlement. You go to the security section and create an API key right there. Now, it's really important to copy that key value and paste it someplace locally because it's the only time you're going to get access to that raw value. And you're going to want to give it some sort of meaningful name so that you can manage these laters when you're not using an API key anymore. You'll want to delete it just to keep your security tidy. So then we have to go back to our diagram and paste that API key into the constant that we're passing to the function to open our session with SystemLink Cloud. And you can also see I've tidied up my diagram and wired my errors and things like that. So after you start running that VI, it will be publishing data to the SystemLink Cloud tag. If you want to verify that your data is being received by SystemLink Cloud, you can go to systemlinkcloud.com and check the tag viewer to verify that the tag has been created with the expected name, and also see the last value that was written to it. So now we're going to create our web application. We're going into GWeb. We're going to create a web application project. It'll initially come up with a WebVI, which is called index.gvi-web. The editor has some side panes that we can minimize to make more space to look at our main VI. And we're just going to place a numeric indicator so we can see our temperature value. And we're going to place a chart so that we can see a history of the values that we've been reading. And on the diagram, we have an unending loop. That's just how WebVIs typically work, is once they load in, they just run continuously. This is going to be a lot like what we did with our VI. We're going to want to open a connection to SystemLink Cloud. We're going to use an API key as the way that we're going to authenticate to it. We're going to connect to api.systemlinkcloud.com. And we're going to open the tag, but this time instead of writing to it, we're going to read the tag value. I have to copy paste my API key that I had saved from before. And you could actually create another API key for the WebVI if you want, but as we'll see later, you don't actually need to keep this once you are deploying your WebVI to the hosting service. So I just temporarily was using the same API key. So we're gonna, after we open the session to SystemLink Cloud, we're gonna open the tag. We have to use the same name that we used from our VI and iConnect.temp. And the same data type. It's a double type of data for that tag. And then inside the loop, we're going to read that tag and place the terminals to send the data to both our numeric indicator and our chart. Now, to verify that this is working correctly, we can run it right in the GWeb editor. Now, this may seem like it's a problem, but it's really just here to emphasize that in order to run the WebVI inside the GWeb editor, you need to have an NI web server running locally for it to connect to. So the editor will helpfully highlight that you don't have the NI web server running, and you can use the button to go to the preferences dialog and find a helpful setup NI web server button, where you can click that to open the configuration utility for NI web server. And for local development, you can just use simple local access. If you actually wanted to host things from this NI web server, you would want to use one of the other options. So we're just going to set up a temporary admin with test password that we can use so that we can run our WebVIs for development debugging purposes inside the IDE. When we come back to the GWeb editor, now we can run the WebVI, and it'll use that NI web server, but display the panel here inside the IDE. You can see that we're running and getting values. So next, what we want to do is host this WebVI in a place where we could access it from other devices, not here on this development machine. So I'm deleting the code that was doing the API key authentication, because once we are hosting this we're going to host it with SystemLink Cloud. And once we're hosting it there in the same place that it's that's hosting the data storage, the tag, it doesn't need that authentication to open the session.
Yeah, to emphasize that again, You do not want to keep your credentials on the diagram when you deploy your WebVI to a place there where users can access it. They're effectively stored in plain text. They're getting shared to the client, and you want to keep those API keys private. So we were using it just for development purposes to test inside of the editor. But once we deploy, we need to make sure to remove the API keys from the diagram.
So now we're going to create a package by right-clicking on the component that the WebVI is in and saying create package from this. The only thing you have to fill out to build your package is your maintainer information. So we're just going to put in something for the maintainer and the contact email. Then you have to make sure that you are building a package rather than a package installer if what you want to do is upload this to SystemLink Cloud. When you try to build, the editor will helpfully tell you that you need to save everything first. After you save it, then you can go back and click the build button. And the build queue will open up to see the progress of the build and let you know when it's complete. Now you can use the locate in File Explorer button to go find the NIPKG file that's your package output, and you're going to need to note where that is to go upload it to SystemLink Cloud in the next step. So now we're going to go to systemlinkcloud.com and go to visualizations and go to the WebVIs tab. And this is going to let you upload that NIPKG file. So again, you can go browse to that location that you were just looking at with the File Explorer to find the file that GWeb had created for you and upload it. And then SystemLink Cloud will be hosting your WebVI, and you can view from there to get a link to it and see your web application running in the cloud, getting the information from that tag that your LabVIEW is publishing. And you could connect to it from a mobile device or anything else that has access to the internet. And you could make that URL something that's controlled, that only certain people can see, that they'd have to log in to be able to see your web application, or you could make it public so that anyone with the URL could see it.
So just as a reminder, what we just saw was we used the GWeb development editor. We created a new UI that's going to be for this test system to see its information. We created a new UI. We used the data service tag API in order to read and write values. We could also use the data service messages API. We built that web application out into an NIPKG, which is essentially a zip file with the HTML, JavaScript, and CSS that represents the panel. Uploaded it to SystemLink Cloud, and we modified our test system to use those same APIs in order to talk to the WebVI. So this is probably the architecture, the configuration you would use for most web applications. What we're going to show now is some tweaks you could do to these architectures for certain patterns, for different conditions, where you might want more configurability. So one example is if you don't want your test system talking directly to the public internet, to SystemLink Cloud, this is a pattern that you could use. I would say it's an uncommon pattern, and it's more policy driven. If your IT or who's designed your test systems has decided that those systems shouldn't talk to the public internet, you have an option of having a separate system on your local network that can that those machines can connect to, so that you would use the same APIs. Your test system, your LabVIEW test system would use the read and write tag APIs, but instead of pointing to SystemLink Cloud, they'll point to the NI web server that you install locally, either on the machine where you install the GWeb development environment that'll install the NI web server there, or a separate machine. So on the NI web server, there's a feature called the Cloud Connector, which is a little UI that when you log into it, you could put your API key from SystemLink Cloud, choose which tags and messages that are on the web server that you want to forward to SystemLink Cloud, and then your WebVI can communicate the system with the system exactly as it did before. It could read and write to tags and messages on systemlinkcloud.com. One limitation of using this approach is that you'll notice the arrows only go one way from the test system to the NI web server to SystemLink Cloud. So you can only forward messages and tags from your test system to SystemLink Cloud. So if you wanted to use your WebVI to control the test system, where you send a message back through SystemLink Cloud back to the test system, you can't do that with this approach. I would say this is more uncommon. It's only if you have that specific network requirement of you can't have your test system talking directly to SystemLink Cloud. And another example is, well, if you don't have data at all, you could use WebVIs to build simple applications that, let's say, do a calculation. You enter in different numbers, it does some logic on the diagram, shows a result. It doesn't actually need to talk to any backend. It doesn't need to use the data services. It's just a simple static WebVI. You could actually build and host those directly on SystemLink Cloud or on other web services that are used in the web development community, like Amazon S3 or GitHub Pages. And one example of that is you could actually visit on your device to webvi.io. And what you'll see is a WebVI here showing the flexible layout panels where we've configured the front panel, the controls on the front panel to how they should change and resize as the window stretches and grows. This is a feature unique to GWeb development software where there's not a logic on the diagram. You just configure the controls on how they resize and they can reposition themselves when the window changes. This is really useful for really performant resizing, so it could work on small mobile devices, mobile phones, as well as your desktop browser performantly, compared to having to do all that logic and resizing logic on the diagram. So this is webvi.io. It is a built WebVI. There's nothing hidden or special about it. If you go to github.com/ni/webvi.io, shown in the screenshot here, you can actually find the source code for this WebVI and download it and open it in GWeb yourself and see how it was made. And another thing to point out is that the instructions there talk about how this WebVI is published to GitHub Pages. So that URL, webvi.io, and you can see it has the little lock and security. That's all handled by the standard GitHub Pages service that lets you host static web applications. And it talks about it a little in there. So if you wanted to make like a small blog or simple utilities that could do some calculations and have those WebVIs be available online, then you don't even need a backend that you're communicating to. You could use any standard static hosting service. All right, so now we're going to switch gears again. We talked about how to make things available on the public internet. But let's say you want something that's just available on your local area network. So one thing I hinted to was that when you host something on your local area network, you could actually reuse a lot of the same hosting service and data services that you would with SystemLink Cloud. And that's because we include the NI web server. So when you install GWeb development software, it installs the NI web server and those data services and hosting services on your system. So you can immediately deploy there. You could also install the NI web server and the different services on a separate system if you want to. You have the ability, your license lets you install them in as many systems as you need. It's not restricted there. So what we would do here is a very similar workflow. We'd create our WebVI and GWeb development software, use the data service VIs on it, modify our test system to read and write to it, the data services. The only change really is where you upload your WebVI. You upload it to your local server and the server that you point to for your API calls and how you do instead of API keys, what you do to sign in and authenticate with those systems. So Christina will now show us an example of how do you modify our previous example, the SystemLink Cloud example, to use it on the local area network.
Thanks, Milan. So yeah, we're going to take that same example that we were just looking at, and we're going to look at the VI that was connecting to SystemLink Cloud with the API key, and we're going to change that instead to connect to an NI web server instance that we have running locally. So we're going to delete that API key. We don't need it. We're going to change the polymorphic instance to HTTP. And now we're going to need to give it the address of the server. For development purposes, we're just going to use localhost because we know it's running here. But normally this would be, the URL of the server that you are going to use. To authenticate, you are going to need to put a username and a password for this. So we're just going to, again, for development purposes, use our admin and test account that we had configured for our NI web server previously and run that. And now we are connecting to that NI web server and publishing to a SystemLink tag, but that tag is being stored by the NI web server that's running on this machine.
One thing to point out is that if you are a user who has SystemLink server and has the system management parts of SystemLink server, then you don't have to enter your credentials like that on the diagram. Part of the system management is that it's able to, if your machine is registered with the SystemLink server, the credentials are all managed for you. So that's one difference there. But yeah, if you're just using what comes with GWeb development software, you have access to the same services. But in this case, in order to do that authentication, you'll need separate credentials that are going to be encoded on the diagram on the test systems themselves. So that's just something to be aware of.
So that was all we needed to change on the VI. Now we'll need to go to our web application. And actually, because we deleted the credentials here, you wouldn't even actually need to modify this at all. You could upload the package that you already created to your NI web server, and it would just work. But when you're developing locally, you probably want to be able to run here in the browser. So we're going to temporarily create a open configuration and similarly connect to the URL, which for now is just localhost, and connect with the password. And again, you really don't want to have your credentials with your username and password when you're done with this WebVI, and you do not want to end up uploading that. But when we've put this here locally, it allows us to run the WebVI easily here in the GWeb editor for development and debugging purposes. And you can see that it is reading the values that the LabVIEW VI is publishing. So again, you really don't want to keep that open configuration in when you are going to build your final package for what you're going to upload. As Milan mentioned earlier, this is stored in the VI or in the WebVI in a way that could be hacked out. So you do not want it to be part of the thing at all when you go to build the uploadable package. So now we want to give this WebVI to our NI web server to host. So we go to localhost, which is going to give us an interface for our web server, and go to web applications, and we can use the import button to find the package that we built from GWeb. And we're not going to be able to talk about the workspace here, but you can put it in the default workspace. And then similarly to how we did it with SystemLink Cloud, you can view from here to see your WebVI running in the browser. Now, when we configured our NI web server previously, we just did simple local access for development purposes, but that's not terribly useful if you're going to want this web user interface to be seen, by other people, because right now it's only visible on your local machine. So you will want to configure your NI web server with one of the other options, and this might involve having to talk to your IT department to make sure that you have the right digital certificates so that you have everything authenticated properly.
So now we're going to talk about some other ways you can modify your local NI web server based deployment for GWeb. So one option is, since LabVIEW 2020, you've been able to deploy custom LabVIEW web services to the NI web server. So this is useful for if you have advanced functionality that doesn't really fit well with the tags and messages paradigm, and you want to have a lot more control of the endpoints. What you could do is you could have your GWeb diagram use the HTTP client to do GET and POST requests to the server, and have a LabVIEW web service to listen for those GET and POST requests, do custom logic, and provide a response back. One thing I want to emphasize here is that if you're using a custom LabVIEW web service deployed to the NI web server, you can't lift and take the same implementation to use with SystemLink Cloud. SystemLink Cloud does not have the ability to deploy new LabVIEW web services there. So if you wanted an architecture that lets you leverage SystemLink Cloud or a local area network, you may want to consider what we talked about earlier, which is having your test system doing that extra logic, having your LabVIEW application that's running there listen for tags and messages. So maybe listens for messages coming from your WebVI asking to get some data out of the database, and then replying with messages back. And that architecture could be used for both. But if you do want that extra customizability and want to implement your own web services, you can use LabVIEW web services deployed to the NI web server. There is the reason this configuration is beneficial for those who have used LabVIEW web services before is that you get to avoid a whole class of problems called cross-origin resource sharing CORS, because your LabVIEW web service is on the same server as your hosting, and that's the same server that you use for development as well. Whenever you use older versions of LabVIEW previous to 2020, or if you choose to deploy to the application web server instead, you probably end up in a situation where you have to understand and deal with cross-origin resource sharing, which is out of the scope of this presentation. Nowadays, you can avoid that whole class of problems altogether for users who have been using GWeb for a while by deploying a LabVIEW web service directly to the NI web server. So another configuration is, let's say you wanted both the test system and LabVIEW web service all inside the same machine. So a common use case here is like a cRIO that has a LabVIEW web service deployed to it. What we want to show here is that you have the capability to build your WebVI in GWeb and use that as the static content for that LabVIEW web service. There are some downsides to this approach. When you deploy directly to a test system, directly to a cRIO, you're using the older application web server technology. So you don't have access to the same services. You don't have access to the data services for tags and messages. You don't have access to the new hosting services. And you don't get all the things that come with it, like our modern approaches for HTTPS certificate management and the user management capabilities that are in the NI web server. You're using the application web server technologies instead. So that's one con. You don't get access to what we consider our modern web server configuration features. And then another problem potentially is that you're putting a lot more load on your system. cRIOs generally are fairly small, lower powered devices that are doing a lot of work already instead of trying to host a web UI and host web services. So our recommended configuration for new applications is to have a separate machine where your WebVI is hosted, and to decouple the web service aspect from the test system a bit more by having data being sent from the test system to that other machine, and that other machine with the NI web server can have many devices connect to it, no problem. We're showing this slide because you may have an existing system, and the shortest path to leveraging capabilities you may want in GWeb development software would be to continue to use your existing LabVIEW web service or application web server based configuration. And in that case, we're here to say you can take the built HTML, JavaScript, CSS, use it as public content on your existing LabVIEW web service for this kind of system configuration. And the last thing I want to point out, which I think is a lot of fun, is if you look at all this and you wish you can use it to make your own IoT device at home, like a Raspberry Pi, to watch when the dryer goes off, and then have a little web application to check the status of your dryer, you're free to do that. We have the LabVIEW Community Edition, and if you weren't aware of it, we also have a GWeb Development Software Community Edition. So both of those are just the full copy of LabVIEW, full copy of GWeb, and you could build and deploy a WebVI to SystemLink Cloud, build and deploy a LabVIEW application to a Raspberry Pi using LabVIEW Community, and use that for your own projects at home. All right. So now we've talked about the different architectures for how to set up, how to augment your test system to communicate with WebVIs, to integrate WebVIs into them. So this next bit is about additional things that are fun to do with WebVIs, how you can extend their capabilities. So one is with the JavaScript library interface. You can kind of think of this as analogous to the call library function node in LabVIEW, where you can call DLLs natively on your system. The JavaScript library interface gives you a way to call into JavaScript code that's in a web page. So this is a way to reuse existing JavaScript libraries that exist in the community. You could add new visualizations. We have the HTML placeholder container where you could put that on the panel and populate that with new visualizations. It does take some knowledge of how to leverage those JavaScript libraries in order to bring them into your web application, but there's lots of examples available. So if you look in the example code repository on ani.com, if you want a direct link to it, you could follow the link at the bottom of the page. That'll take you to a place where you could search for existing WebVI examples to use as a starting point or to leverage off the bat. So, and here we see one example of the leaflet map. So to have interactive drag and drop maps with markers, they can configure their contents, zoom in and out. There's a library in the example code repository that will let you add that map control to your application. And you could find other examples in there as well. So if you want to learn more about GWeb development software, a great spot is the GitHub pages. We have all our examples hosted on GitHub, and you can click and view them online at the URL shown there. We also have the NI discussion forums, and there's a GWeb discussion forum where you could talk with other GWeb users. You could find examples in the software and online, and there's also a course from NI to learn GWeb. And those, you could find all those links at the same URL from the previous slide shown here.
So thanks, Milan. If you have any questions, we'll see you on the forums. Thank you for watching.